Welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Gearing up your character with armor that contains varying stats is, well, a core part of the RPG experience. I myself tend to equip my mage with lots of charisma and wisdom gear. Okay, obviously WoW doesn't have those stats, but maybe it should because the current roster of stats is, I hesitate to say boring, but definitely stale. Actually, yeah, no, they are boring, and thinking about them for even a brief moment of time makes it become clear why. But before we do that, just to put things in perspective, the stats available to players haven't really changed since Legion. Like, at all. That makes Midnight the 6th expansion with the current setup, which is especially crazy considering Legion followed up Warlords of Draenor, which was actually very aggressive in its attempts to iterate on stats. First, let's briefly touch on the primary stats, which, at least nowadays, boil down to just passive buffs that come with eye level. Stamina equals health. Strength, agility, and intellect are basically all thematic variations on a generic throughput stat. I guess strength also grants some parry, and agility also grants some dodge too. Still, outside of the occasional trinket or enchanting choice, you are never really opting into any of these stats. So, while I recognize their value in the game as being more flavorful than just saying eye level, I don't really think you can describe any of them as interesting. Where actual choice is somewhat present is in secondary stats, so let's run through the 4 that we currently have. This shouldn't take long. You know how they work. Crit is just a chance to do extra damage, generally double. I suppose sometimes in PvP a crit can be impactful, but in most PvE situations, it just gets flattened out over dozens if not hundreds of ability uses and may as well be considered a universal throughput stat. Though there are some exceptions to this, such as Fire Mage, whose hot streak effect is dependent on getting 2 consecutive crits. Haste basically speeds everything up. Auto attacks, cast times, how quickly dots and hots tick. There used to be breakpoints on dots and hots that would cause haste value to grow as you neared a breakpoint and then plummet thereafter. Thankfully, breakpoints aren't a thing anymore for the same reason hit was removed. Versatility is literally just a pure throughput stat. Technically, it has the flavor of reducing incoming damage at half the rate that your output goes up, so if you had 20% verse, you would do 20% more damage and take 10% less damage. I guess that could be interesting in a single-player RPG, but in an MMO, nobody is going to consider the defensive benefits of a stat over the offensive benefits, unless you're a tank, and even then it's not always a priority. If you build for verse, it's probably just because it sims the best for you. Mastery is definitely the secondary that has the most to say about it, for the simple reason that every spec has a different mastery. Sounds really good in theory, and gives Blizzard an easy knob for tuning. Unfortunately, I found that the majority of masteries in the game basically just increase the damage output of most, if not all of your abilities anyway. There are a few interesting ones that I'll shout out later though, most often with healing specs, as healers are innately less concerned with pure throughput than DPS or even tanks. Lastly, we have tertiary stats, which are simply random minor perks that can appear on gear and were meant as sort of a replacement for the more controversial Thunderforging / Warforging / Titanforging. There are 3 such stats and 5 possible perks that can appear. Avoidance reduces AoE damage taken, Leech will heal the player for a % of all damage and healing they deal, and Speed increases movement speed. The other 2 perks are Indestructible, which makes an item immune to durability loss, and a gem socket on a slot that can have them, though you can add gems to normal pieces of gear, usually through the Great Vault currency option. While I like the idea of tertiary stats, the fact that they're mostly just a random benefit takes a lot of the appeal out of them. I know some players will go out of their way to collect speed gear in every slot so they can move really dang fast, especially Havoc Demon Hunters who also gain speed based on their mastery. But this takes a lot of work and is so RNG dependent that whatever set you do throw together is very unlikely to be useful in competitive content. It's more something you wear to farm old content more efficiently. And that's where we're at. Originally, I did cover all of the removed stats we've had over the years, but that script got a bit bloated. Suffice to say that most boil down to more raw damage or working around a cap that didn't actually provide personal choice. Only 2 or 3 are of major note to me. One is Multi-Strike, which existed as a secondary in WoD and was sort of crit by another name as it had a chance to fire off additional weaker attacks, but these could trigger procs, so there was some distinction. But we used to actually have a 5th primary stat, and probably the most interesting one, Spirit. It was changed to a secondary in WoD and removed in Legion. And this one kind of kills me, because in terms of affecting how you play, it was by far the most impactful primary. Spirit was basically the mana regen stat, and therefore mostly a healer stat. It essentially posed the choice to you of do you want more throughput up front, or do you want to build for the long game. There was also the mana per 5 seconds pseudo stat that factored into all of this, but I'll avoid that tangent for now. While I think bringing Spirit back could be fun, it's hard to imagine a way to do so while making this stat appealing to non-healer specs. We could have it apply to other resources, but that's a whole can of worms I'm not going to touch. Anyway, let's circle back around. Our current setup is basically choosing 2 stats per slot from a pool of 4, with 3 of those 4 often boiling down to do more damage. So why did we wind up here? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I suspect Blizzard wanted to reduce situations where we're disappointed with a piece of gear. If none of the stats do anything interesting, then it's easier to tune them to be closer in value. But I think this is a backwards approach to take. Sure, it might feel rare to get a genuinely bad piece of gear, but if we have no valleys, then we have no peaks. Other than some trinkets, there's very little gear that feels like a big upgrade based on stats. Though, more importantly, there's essentially 0 gear that feels like it's changing how you play or customizing your character at all. Okay, complaining is all well and good, but what can we actually do about it? Well, I think it's okay to keep primaries as they are. Colorful stand-ins for what is essentially power. Haste is fine as is. As I stated earlier, haste is the only current stat that always has some sort of effect on your gameplay. And while crit is basically just a raw universal throughput increase, I feel like crits are such a core concept of not only a WoW stat, not only an MMO stat, but an RPG stat in general, that it'd just feel wrong to get rid of it. I would though try to engineer mechanics for more specs that utilize it in an interesting way, like Fire Mage does. I do have 3 proposed changes to make, though I should caveat that this wouldn't be done in a vacuum. It would require overhauls to several abilities and talents. Especially talents, honestly, because those trees are bloated as heck, and I think shifting some of their functionality in elsewhere would be a good idea. First of all, we're ditching versatility. It's a boring stat. Nobody likes it, and nobody ever did, from what I've seen, except I guess in a PvP context. I'm replacing it with a new secondary stat, Readiness. This was actually originally planned for WoD, with it and Multi-Strike both being statified versions of popular 5.4 trinkets. Essentially, Readiness would reduce cooldowns of various, well, cooldowns for your spec. Though it never went live, I feel like they took the appeal of cooldown reduction and started using it more and more across class design, such as with Holy Priest's Holy Word spells. I assume Blizz just found it hard to balance around, but to me, this always seemed like the greatest missed opportunity for a really fun stat to have around. So let's bring it back. It would have very real, tangible effects on your gameplay. Why not reduce that 90-second cooldown to an 89-second cooldown? Or even down to 60 seconds if you go all in. I suppose you could argue this also creates breakpoints based on encounter duration, but I feel like those are variable enough to not be that big of a deal. Second change. Endeavor to make sure most, if not every mastery, is more interesting than just do more damage. I mean, this is the stat that each specialization gets to have their own custom effect for. Why then is it so rare to have fun ones? It's okay if some of them feel a bit niche or controversial. It's okay if some make it clearly the best stat for a spec or clearly the worst. And yes, in an ideal world, everyone would change how your spec plays a little bit as you get more and more of the stat. But that's hard to do for so many specs, so I'll settle for ones with fun side effects or that package their bonus damage in fun ways. Some examples of cool masteries of the past, present, and in my head are the following. Marksmanship Hunters also increase their max range, and that's really cool. Havoc Demon Hunters also increases their movement speed, and that's also really cool. Holy Priest's Echo of Light causes a portion of all healing you do to add a brief HOD effect to your healing recipients. I like this one because it's sort of a throughput increase and helps smooth out incoming damage, but you have to be willing to accept that a lot of it is going to be wasted as overhealing. Restoration shamans scale with how low their target's health is. I know many hate this, but a choice of more throughput when it really matters versus more throughput all the time is an interesting one. Holy Paladins scales with their proximity to their targets, encouraging them to be in melee. I know this one is also widely hated, but it does offer a choice on if you want to gear for that or forego it. Holy Paladins also used to have a fun one that converted a portion of all healing into absorb shields. This is similar to Holy Priests as a fun choice. Mistweaver monks used to have Gift of the Serpent, which gave your healing spells a chance to spawn a healing orb on the ground that would heal anyone who ran over them. I talk more about it in my dedicated Mop Mistweaver video, but I absolutely loved this mastery. It was so fun generating a sea of orbs for people to trip over, and very much felt like a stat you took if you cared more about long-term healing over short-term. Icicles were a fun way of doing delayed damage for Frostmage, and even interacted with Glacial Spike, even if I hated that spell. An original of mine would be to give Affliction Warlocks back Curse of Doom, but as their mastery. A portion of all shadow damage they deal would get stored and doled out 60 seconds after their initial hit. This would kind of really suck in M+, and potentially be very good in Raid, depending on tuning and fight duration. Maybe this one just appeals to my love of delaying gratification. Or how about a DPS version of Gift of the Serpent, for, I don't know, Frost or Unholy DKs? Your abilities would have a chance to spawn a rune on the ground that blows up when enemies step on it. And the third change I would make is quite fittingly for tertiaries. I think they should just be something we have way more control over. You can keep the same three of speed, leech, and avoidance. Just make it something we can customize heavily through enchants, gems, and the like, instead of being almost purely RNG. As a mage, while I certainly don't dislike speed, it's perhaps not the most relevant as I don't run out of bigger ground effects. I blink out. But in almost every game I've ever played, I've been a sucker for passive healing effects, so I would stack the heck out of Leech and get some orange healing parses. I actually remember getting some of those during Emerald Nightmare somehow. Anyway, that's my take on stats in World of Warcraft as they currently exist, and some ideas I have for how to make them more interesting. Those ideas being to swap versatility for readiness, make more masteries interesting in some way, and to make tertiaries a choice instead of random. But I would also love to hear what interesting ideas you have for secondary stats, or what kooky ideas you have for fun masteries, because I feel like I wasn't that inventive. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Cthulhu, making him the third of the old gods I've depicted, because this is a video about stats. And quite famously, Ian Hazacostas, back when he and the elitist jerks were raiding in vanilla, proved that Cthulhu was mathematically impossible to kill. And you know, a Lovecraftian horror is also kind of fitting for a video about stats, because there's nothing more horrifying than non-Euclidean geometry. I think he turned out mostly okay, though I wasn't able to get down that filmy effect on top of the eyeball. And I, of course, put him in the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, because where the heck else would I put him? These guys aren't exactly known for being mobile. I also added the Titan prison chains that I had for N'Zoth and Yogg-Saron. I know these aren't present at all in AQ40, but I believe the place did serve as his prison. It's more the fact that that concept hadn't really been introduced at that point in time, and I think his first breakout was actually during the War of the Shifting Sands, which was centuries ago, so it's understandable that they would be gone anyway, but whatever, I wanted to include them. I also included some shadowy cultists like I did with Yogg and N'Zoth. I tried to model them after the Karaji. I was surprised I didn't do Nerubians for Yogg-Saron, but I suppose there aren't actually any Nerubians in Ulduar, even if they are the Akir followers associated with him. I am not entirely looking forward to the nightmare that will be drawing Y'Shaarj. He is slightly more complicated than a giant eyeball with tentacles. So then, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye. Bye.